All right, so today we are going to be looking at Freeport-McMoRan,
Mm-hmm.
ticker symbol FCX.
Yes.
And we've got a report here that is recommending a buy
Interesting.
for this stock. And we've got all kinds of research, financial data analyst opinions, even some company statements.
Okay.
And honestly, some of this stuff is kind of wild.
Like what?
There's a smelter fire in Indonesia we're going to talk about.
Mm-hmm.
There's this whole thing about copper and its future,
Okay.
which is kind of
You
fascinating.
don't hear that every day.
No, you don't.
So I'm curious about the buy recommendation, though.
Yeah.
Because it sounds like there's some challenges facing FCX right now.
Oh, absolutely.
But the analysts are still bullish.
Yeah, that's what's so interesting about this report.
Okay, well, let's back up for a sec.
Sure.
For those who aren't familiar.
Right.
Can you give us a quick overview of what Freeport-McMoRan actually does?
They're a mining company,
Okay.
and I mean a big one.
Mm-hmm.
They mine copper, gold, and molybdenum.
Oh.
And they're not just like some small-time operation.
No.
They have operations in North America, South America, and Indonesia.
Okay, so they're global.
Global. Yeah, and this is where it gets interesting for investors.
How so?
Well, their focus is really on copper.
Copper. Yeah, well, that makes sense. With all the talk about electric vehicles and renewable energy,
Exactly.
copper is essential for all of that.
Huge demand.
Huge.
And it's only going to grow.
Yeah, you've got EVs, solar panels, wind turbines.
All of it needs copper.
It's like the backbone of this whole green technology revolution.
And that's where FCX comes in.
So they're poised to benefit from this trend.
Big time.
Okay, so what's their strategy for meeting this growing demand?
Well, they're doing a few things.
Right.
First, they're expanding their existing operations.
Where are they doing that?
The report mentions a bunch of places: Grasberg, Baghdad, Safford, Lone Star, and El Abra.
Wow, that's ambitious.
Yeah, they're going all in on this copper thing.
But it's not just about digging more holes, right?
No, they're also getting really innovative with how they extract the copper.
Like how?
Well, there's this thing called a leaching initiative.
Leaching.
Yeah, basically they're finding ways to recover copper from what was previously considered rust material.
So they're turning trash into treasure.
Pretty much, and it could be huge for them.
Wow, that's smart.
Right. And then on top of that, they're using all kinds of new technology, like autonomous haul trucks.
Really?
Yeah, they're trying to make their operations as efficient as possible.
So they're really positioning themselves for a future where copper is king.
Absolutely. They see
Yeah.
the writing on the wall, and they're making the moves to capitalize on it.
Sounds like they're not afraid to take risks.
Well, no investment is without risk, right?
True enough, and this report acknowledges that.
Yeah, especially when it comes to the price of copper.
Right, that's always a factor.
I mean, it can fluctuate pretty wildly depending on global supply and demand.
So even if FCX does everything right, a sudden drop in copper prices could hurt their bottom line.
Exactly. It's a risk they can't completely control.
Okay, so what other risks should investors be aware of?
Well, there's one big one that we need to talk about:
Which is?
geopolitical risk.
Oh, boy.
And it all centers around their operations in Indonesia.
Ah, Indonesia. Now that's a whole other can of worms.
It sure is, and we're going to dive into that right after this.
Indonesia, yeah, it's a key part of their operations, but it's also a source of a lot of uncertainty.
Definitely makes investors nervous.
Yeah, for sure.
I mean, if something goes wrong in Indonesia, it could have a ripple effect on the entire company.
Right, and that's something the report really digs into.
Okay, well, before we go too deep on the whole Indonesia thing,
Sure.
there are a couple of other recent events that we should touch on,
Okay.
like that smelter fire.
Oh, right, the one in Indonesia.
Yeah, that was a pretty big setback.
It was, but the report says it's only temporary.
Okay.
Most of the costs are covered by insurance.
Phew, that's good.
Yeah, and FCX is working to get everything back up and running as soon as possible.
So not a total disaster.
No, not really.
Okay, so what about those planned maintenance projects?
Oh, yeah. Those are going to impact copper sales in 2025.
Yeah, what's the deal with that?
Well, it's just routine maintenance.
Right.
You know, I got to keep those mines running smoothly.
I guess that makes sense.
And it's important for safety, too.
Right.
So it's a short-term hit to production, but it's necessary for long-term success.
Okay, so short-term pain for long-term gain.
Exactly.
Got it. But how does all this fit into the analyst's buy recommendation?
Well, even with these challenges, the report is still bullish on FCX.
Huh?
They believe that the company's long-term growth potential outweighs the risks.
Okay, so what makes them so optimistic?
Well, for one thing, FCX has huge copper reserves and resources.
They're sitting on a mountain of copper.
Pretty much, and they're in a great position to benefit from that growing demand we talked about earlier.
And they're not just sitting around waiting for things to happen, are
No,
they?
they're not. They're actively investing in expanding their operations and developing new technologies.
Right, we talked about all that.
And that's another reason why the analysts are so bullish.
So even though there were some short-term bumps in the road, the long-term outlook is still positive.
Exactly.
Now I think it's time to dig into those earnings call takeaways.
Yeah, let's see what the company itself had to say.
Okay, so the report mentions that FCX adjusted their 2025 copper sales guidance downward.
Downward, yeah, about 5%.
Why the decrease?
Well, part of it is due to those planned maintenance projects.
Right, makes sense.
And there's also the possibility of some delays in export approvals from Indonesia.
There's that Indonesia uncertainty again.
Yeah, it's always lurking in the background.
But didn't the report also say something about gold sales increasing?
Yes, they did.
Did the earnings call address that?
They did. They're actually expecting a pretty significant increase in gold sales.
Oh, really? How much?
About 7% higher than their previous projections.
Wow, that's a nice boost.
Yeah, it'll help to offset some of the lost copper revenue.
So it sounds like it's kind of a mixed bag on the sales front.
Yeah, copper slightly down, gold up.
What about spending any changes to their capital expenditure plans?
Actually, they increased their CapEx budget
Increased, huh?
for both 2025 and 2026.
Now, that's usually a red flag for investors.
It can be, but in this case, FCX explained that the increased spending is going towards those organic growth projects.
Oh, so those expansions we talked about earlier.
Exactly. They're putting their money where their mouth is.
So they're not just blowing money on random stuff.
No, they're making targeted investments that they believe will generate long-term value.
And that's what investors want to hear.
Exactly.
They also emphasize their commitment to a strong balance sheet.
Right. They want to reassure investors that they're being financially responsible.
Okay, well, that all sounds good.
Yeah.
But we can't ignore the elephant in the room.
No, we can't.
That Indonesia situation.
It's the wild card.
It really could make or break FCX's future.
It could, and that's where we need to focus our attention next.
Okay, so Indonesia, it's a big reel for FCX.
Huge. I mean, it's where a lot of their copper comes from.
But it's also a risky place to do business.
Right. Yeah, there are a lot of challenges.
Like what specifically?
Well, you've got export approvals, license extensions, and the potential for regulatory changes.
Oh, boy.
It's a lot to keep track of.
So it's not just a matter of digging up the copper and shipping it out.
Nope, not at all.
What are some of the hoops they have to jump through?
Well, the Indonesian government wants companies to process raw materials within the country.
So they're trying to keep those jobs and profits in Indonesia.
Exactly. And that means FCX has to get export approvals, which can be a slow and unpredictable process.
So that creates uncertainty for the company.
Absolutely.
And what about those license extensions?
Right. Their current licenses expire in 2041.
Not that far off.
No. And they'll need to negotiate new ones with the government if they want to keep operating those mines.
Do you think they'll get them?
It's hard to say. The Indonesian government has been known to renegotiate contracts and demand a bigger share of the profits.
So there's a chance FCX could be forced to scale back their operations or even pull out completely.
It's a possibility, and that's a big risk for investors.
Okay, so with all this uncertainty hanging over their heads, how can the report still recommend a buy for FCX?
Well, they acknowledge the risks, but they also point out a few key things.
Like what?
First, FCX has a long history of operating in Indonesia. They know how to navigate the system.
So they've got experience on their side.
Yeah, and they've built relationships with government officials, which can be helpful.
Okay.
Well, FCX has also been diversifying their operations. They're not putting all their eggs in the Indonesia basket.
So they're spreading the risk.
Exactly. They've been investing in expansions in North and South America.
Makes sense.
And finally, the report argues that the potential rewards of investing in FCX outweigh the risks.
Because of that huge copper demand.
Exactly. They're in a prime position to capitalize on that.
So it's a calculated gamble.
You could say that.
High risk, high reward.
Yeah, but ultimately, it's up to each individual investor to decide if that level of risk is right for them.
Right. It all comes down to your own investment goals and tolerance for risk.
Exactly.
Well, there you have it, folks. We've taken a deep dive into Freeport-McMoRan.
We've covered a lot of ground.
From their ambitious growth plans to the challenges they're facing in Indonesia.
We've looked at the financials, the earnings call, the risks, and the potential rewards.
Now it's up to you to decide if FCX is the right investment for you.
Do your own research, consider your own circumstances, and make an informed decision.
And that wraps up another deep dive. We hope you found this analysis helpful. If you did, be sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you don't miss out on future episodes. We'll be back soon with more in-depth explorations of the companies and trends shaping the world around us. Until then, happy investing.